All right. So first off, just want to say apologies for not having a video out on the channel over the last couple of days. Been kind of under the weather and dealing with something with my throat, so it's kind of hard for me to speak for an extended period of time. So I'm going to do my best throughout this one. Just wanted to give you guys a couple of quick updates. I'll probably have 2 or 3 videos out today, hopefully. At least that's the goal. And then I also have an interview that I'm going to be doing later today with Jordan Ewell. So that'll be up on the channel tomorrow. And then I also have an interview coming up with Kyle Kalinske on Monday, where we're going to be breaking down Israel and Gaza and all of the rest of that. So a couple of things to look forward to. But with that being said, I want to get into this video here, which is basically some of the attempts that have been made at pressuring members of Congress to call for a ceasefire, which seems like it should be the bare fucking minimum at this point. I mean, over the last couple of days, and I'm going to do a separate video on this either today or tomorrow, Israel has launched what seems to be the most aggressive bombing campaign since October 7th on the Gaza Strip. They've essentially cut off the entirety of not only obviously the water, the electricity, the fuel, the food that's getting into Gaza, but also at this point have essentially completely cut off telecommunications, meaning that it's incredibly difficult to actually get a real accurate picture of what is going on the ground. But from what we do know, again, it seems like it was the most aggressive bombing that we have seen so far over the last couple of weeks. And at this point, the casualty numbers I've seen as high as 7,000 to 8,000 Palestinians in Gaza that have been killed, and obviously the humanitarian system or a situation on the ground, especially with the hospitals there collapsing, is probably one of the worst that we are currently seeing on the face of the planet at the moment. And so you would think that like a ceasefire would be the bare minimum, especially for progressive or so-called progressive members of Congress like Bernie Sanders. But here we have from Ryan Grimm some sort of like a staffer or former staffer revolt here going on. So he says 290. At this point, it's now grown to over 300. Former Bernie Sanders staffers are urging the senator to sponsor a ceasefire now Senate resolution. And so let's just go ahead and watch a little bit of this video compilation that was put together by, I believe this is The Intercepts.
Hi, Bernie.
Hey, Bernie.
Hi, Senator Sanders. My name is Raya Al-Nassour.
My name is Kevin Rabinovich.
My name is Youngjung Cho.
Nuseba.
David Shore.
Brianna Blewett.
Michaela Kaplan.
Hannah Fertig.
Lakshmi Devi Gopal.
Daniela.
Becca Rast.
Waleed Shahid.
My name is Erica England, and I work for you, Bernie.
My name is Shabad Singh, and I worked for you, Bernie.
We were inspired by your campaign and leadership.
In part because of your deep anti-war convictions.
I am opposed to giving the president a blank check to launch a unilateral invasion and occupation of Iraq.
Your fight for dignity and justice for all.
And your deep commitment to the basic humanity of all Israelis and Palestinians.
We are going to have to treat the Palestinian people with respect and dignity.
As a fellow Jewish American, this is something that I've always admired about you and why I came to work for you.
We are disappointed that you have not taken leadership in this moment, calling for a ceasefire.
Particularly when grief is being weaponized by American politicians to support horrific atrocities by Israel against Palestinian civilians.
And all of this is funded by our government.
Ceasefire now! Ceasefire! All right, so I'll go ahead and cut off the video there, but you guys get a gist of what they're saying there. And I mean, this is obviously, again, they're 100% correct here, not just in terms of their analysis of Bernie Sanders, who typically has been a more anti-war voice throughout his, lengthy career in Congress. But it seems like this is just a different issue for him, I guess, right? I mean, obviously there's not many senators, if any, in the entirety of the elected Senate body right now that I would say are good on the issue of Israel and Palestine. But you would hope and plead that maybe Bernie Sanders would be like the lone voice who would be willing in a moment like this to come out and call for a ceasefire. So it's been incredibly disappointing. I mean, obviously Bernie Sanders is somebody who was incredibly formative for me personally in developing my politics, especially with domestic policy. But it seems like this is just an issue where he is not willing to sort of lay his legacy on the ground to stand on the right side of history. And it's, again, incredibly disappointing. And this comes as they pointed out there. I mean, you had several Jewish Americans, which Bernie is obviously Jewish himself as well, who were pointing out the fact that, like, there is dissent here. I mean, there is dissent amongst Jewish voices, not just in the United States, but also in Israel and around the rest of the world. I personally, as I talked about a couple of days ago on this channel, went to an If Not Now protest here in Washington, D.C., right outside the White House, and covered a bit of that protest for Breaking Points. And you had plenty of Jewish people who were out there who were, against the endless bombardment of the Gaza Strip and who were trying to stand up for Palestinian people to be treated like human beings. You also have a bunch of other groups like Jewish Voices for Peace, peace. That's another one that just recently, and I'll cover this in a different video on all of the protests that have been happening, occupied Central Station in New York City and did this mass sit-in protest where they are trying to call for a ceasefire. And it seems like, there's been this incredible weaponization here of, a lot of the grief that has come out from the October 7th Hamas attack into southern Israel, and that is being weaponized, disingenuously weaponized, to justify what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people in Gaza right now. And again, I mean, it's such a ridiculous argument to make, right? Oh, Israel is acting in self-defense. Israel has a right to self-defense, and obviously they have to respond to what happened on October 7th. But what we've been actually seeing on the ground since October 7th for the Palestinian people in Gaza and in the West Bank has just been incredible amounts of brutality. I mean, more brutality than even Hamas put on display on October 7th. I mean, they've already killed, again, as I pointed out, the latest estimates are over 7,000 Palestinians in Gaza. I've seen hundreds and hundreds of Palestinians been brutalized or killed in the West Bank during this as tensions escalate with a lot of, radical Jewish settlers in the West Bank who are being armed by, outright fascists like Itamar Ben-Gvir and the Benjamin Netanyahu coalition right now, and are going out, and I've seen videos of them, shooting Palestinians in the West Bank at point blank range and massacring them. So I mean, like, this is what's actually happening here. And again, I think it's incredibly important to point out that, like, this is not a one-sided issue, right? Like, this is not like you stand with Israel and you stand with the Jewish people, or else you're anti-Semitic or you are on the side of Hamas or something like that. Like, no, there is an incredible amount of dissent that is currently taking place around the world. It's just not featured in the United States government, and that unfortunately includes guys like Bernie Sanders here. I mean, here's a quote. He gave this entire speech before Congress. Obviously, I'm not going to play this entire 6-minute, 50-second clip here, but this was the gist of it. He says, the time is now for a humanitarian pause. I mean, I want to just focus on that language there. The time is now for a humanitarian pause in the bombing so that desperately needed aid can get to men, women, and children of Gaza, and that the hostages, obviously Israeli hostages, can be immediately released. We must avert a total and horrific humanitarian disaster. Here is my speech on the Senate floor. So many different things about this. We must avert a total and horrific humanitarian disaster. It's too late for that. That's already the situation right now. I mean, you have the Palestinians in Gaza have no reliable access to food, to water, to electricity, to communications, to be able to contact emergency services within Gaza, nor do they have the ability to communicate with the outside world right now. I mean, you have 1 million people who have been displaced from their homes. You have 42% at least of the housing within Gaza that has already been obliterated. You have hospitals that are utterly, collapsing as we speak. I mean, I've seen just absolutely terrifying videos that have come out over the last couple of days of doctors who are literally having to, and I know this is graphic, but this is what's actually happening, literally having to, perform amputations and surgeries on children in front of their family members without any anesthesia. Okay, because they do not have adequate access to medical supplies. I mean, we saw stories of doctors having to drink IV bags, right? We've seen stories of all of these horrible atrocities that are happening just because of the lack of medical supplies that has gotten into Gaza. So the idea that, we have to try to prevent a horrific humanitarian disaster, it's fucking too late for that. It's already too late for that. Obviously, a ceasefire would be the only, reliable method to actually potentially get adequate aid in. And we've seen some sort of aid that's been able to trickle through from Biden. He put a little bit of pressure on the Israelis to allow a limited amount of aid through, but then you had that first day where you had 20 trucks or something that were able to get into Gaza, and then the UN crunched the math on that, and it was enough supplies for 22,000 people for one day. I mean, it's a pathetic excuse, right? But then, I mean, again, humanitarian pause in the bombing. Humanitarian pause in the bombing. Okay, now what does this imply? Well, what it implies is that Israel has been justified up until this point in their bombing campaign in Gaza, which has killed a vast majority innocent men, women, and children, disproportionately children. Roughly half of the roughly 7,000 that have been killed so far, based on the numbers that we know, have been kids. We're talking about over 3,000 children that have been killed so far. So when you say a humanitarian pause, what does that mean? You're going to pause for a couple of days, allow a little bit of water, a little bit of food and fuel to get in, maybe some medical supplies, and then resume the bombing campaign that has been massacring these people? Is that what we're talking about? I mean, again, the fundamental issue here is the bombing itself. There's no humanitarian pause in the bombing when the humanitarian crisis is being caused by the bombing. You can't just call for a pause and think that that's going to be, enough to solve the situation. which then doesn't even get into the further conversations that need to be happening at a moment like this of the Israeli occupation, of the siege on Gaza that is going on nearly 2 decades now, okay? Of the endless expansions of illegal settlements into the West Bank and the settler, terrorism that is backed by the IDF in the West Bank, the attacks on Al-Aqsa Mosque. I mean, so many different things we could get into. Those are the fundamental underlying things that need to be addressed right now. But somehow, even the most progressive members of the Senate are having a conversation about a humanitarian pause so that we can get aid to them, and then I guess Israel can resume the invasion and the bombing after the fact. I mean, it's so fucking pathetic, man. It's so deeply disappointing. Probably the single most disappointing thing that I've seen from Bernie Sanders throughout the entirety of, as far as I've been tracking him over the last, decade or so, basically. We also had here from Ro Khanna, fellow, so-called progressive, I guess, in Congress. I agree with Secretary Blinken, Jamie Raskin, and Bernie Sanders. First of all, if you ever say, I agree with Secretary Blinken when it comes to a foreign policy matter, you're probably on the wrong side of it. But he says, I agree with him and Jamie Raskin and Bernie Sanders for a humanitarian pause. Again, there's that, disingenuous language here to ensure safe passage and so that food, fuel, and electricity and water gets to civilians in Gaza so that we can work to release the hostages and so that widespread bombs do not kill civilians. So again, a couple of different things here. They talk about this as if this was some sort of a natural disaster, as if this was an earthquake that hit Gaza, and we need to get in food and fuel and water and all of that. That's not the reason that the people in Gaza don't have food, fuel, and water. We know this because the Minister of Defense, Gallant, before this massive bombing campaign took place, explicitly laid it out for us. He said, we are fighting human animals. We are going to cut off their electricity, their water, their food, their fuel. Nothing will get in and out of the Gaza Strip. That's what he said. Okay, and the purpose of that was to impose collective punishment on the Palestinians. So the first thing that needs to be addressed here is that this is a war crime by the government of Israel. This is not something that just accidentally whoops-a-daisy happened and we need to get some emergency aid in there. Yeah, of course we need emergency aid to get in there, but that's not the core of the problem. The core of the problem is that the humanitarian crisis was being caused and is being caused by Israeli policy that you, for some reason, have nothing to say. Okay, they don't notice how they don't address that, right? Bernie didn't address that. Ro Khanna didn't address that. I mean, again, we need a humanitarian pause, as if this is something that just magically happened. No, this is a direct cause of Israeli foreign policy in the region. Okay, and then he continues here. We need to get all of his supplies into Gaza so that we can work to release hostages, and so that widespread bombs do not kill innocent civilians. What the fuck does that even mean? I mean, genuinely, listen, on a personal level, I've met Ro Khanna a bunch of different times, and he's a nice guy and everything, and I agree with him on many different policies, but what the fuck does that mean? So that widespread bombs do not kill innocent civilians is a humanitarian pause, as you're calling it? Is that going to, what? Prevent Israeli bombs from killing civilians in Gaza? What are we talking about? I mean, this is absolutely delusional, okay? That has nothing to do with Israel indiscriminately bombing Gaza, okay, and killing innocent men, women, and children. Okay, the humanitarian pause doesn't affect that in any way, shape, or form. It's Israeli policy that is doing that. Okay, so they're from Ro Khanna. He says at this point, with reports of telecommunications cut off in Gaza, including for civilians, a humanitarian pause, as if this is going to continue. Now, keep in mind, every single reputable human rights organization that I have seen that has been tracking all of this very closely, okay, they're calling for ceasefires. This language of a humanitarian pause, it's like they just pulled it out of their ass. I have no idea where the fuck they even got this language from. A ceasefire to end this destruction. It's already at apocalyptic levels within Gaza. It can't really get much worse than this, but unfortunately it looks like it's going to get much worse than this. And it seems like they're okay with that as long as we get a little bit of food, a little bit of, water and fuel, and just temporarily hold them over, I guess, for the next bombing campaign that Israel is going to launch, as if any of this is justified. And the worst of the worst that I have seen from, I guess, so-called progressives within the Senate and the House has been this guy, John Fetterman. Now, again, I knew this beforehand. Obviously, I talked about this when he was running for election against Dr. Oz. I talked about the gaps in what I thought was a relatively solid policy agenda from John Fetterman, specifically when it came to Israel. And, even with that, even with my previous critiques of him on this issue, I was not expecting this kind of shit. He says here, now is not the time to talk about a ceasefire. We must support Israel in its efforts to eliminate Hamas terrorists who slaughtered innocent men, women, and children. Hamas does not want peace. They want to destroy Israel. We can talk about a ceasefire after Hamas is neutralized, which is something that, first off, is not even a guarantee that that's even ever going to happen, that you're going to be able to go into Gaza in some sort of a ground offensive and completely eradicate Hamas, no matter how many tens of thousands of Palestinians you kill in the process, okay? But I mean, again, pointing out here, we must support Israel in its efforts to eliminate the Hamas terrorists who slaughtered innocent men, women, and children. Okay, now listen, if Israel was conducting a targeted raid into Gaza to only go after, okay, or even a majority of the people that they were going after were the Hamas people, the Hamas militants who went in and killed civilians in Israel, nobody would have an issue with that. Okay, nobody would have an issue if they were just taking out some of the terrorists who, killed innocent civilians in Israel. Nobody would have an issue with that. The issue is that that's not what's fucking happening. Okay, and so this is what bothers me the most about guys like John Fetterman and Ro Khanna and Bernie Sanders, is that it's like they want to get around moral culpability for endorsing this slaughter of innocent civilians in Gaza. Okay, they want to get around that moral culpability by appealing to some sort of like idealistic bombing campaign that only goes after Hamas militants. A bombing campaign that does not exist, that has never existed, okay, and will not exist going into the future. All right, and so that's sort of like, I guess, the dance that they're playing here. All right, we need to go after Hamas. We need to eradicate Hamas. That's not what's happening. Sorry to tell you, a vast majority of the people that are being killed right now are innocent men, women, and children. Again, disproportionately children in Gaza. And they just want to hide behind this. They want to pretend as if this isn't what's happening, that Israel has a right to go after Hamas. That's not what they're doing. They're not going after Hamas. They're going after every single person in Gaza. Don't take my word for it. Go and look at the rhetoric of guys like Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant and Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. Go and look at their own rhetoric to understand exactly who they're targeting. They're not targeting Hamas. They're targeting every single Palestinian. The president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, towards the beginning of this bombing campaign, outright came out and said there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. That's what he said. That's what he said. Okay? And again, the other rhetoric, we're fighting human animals, in the words of Gallant. I mean, this is what you're endorsing. To call it a stain on any of these guys' record would be a dramatic understatement here. He had a couple other tweets here that I just wanted to show you guys real quick. He says, 2 things can be true at the same time. I unequivocally stand with Israel and demand an immediate release of all hostages. I grieve for all Palestinian lives lost. We must minimize suffering in Gaza, and our humanitarian aid efforts must match the need. So, I mean, again, here's the difference here. I unequivocally stand with Israel, who has been massacring innocent Palestinians in Gaza. And then he turns around and he has the audacity to say, I grieve for all innocent Palestinian lives lost. No, you don't. No, you don't. I mean, that's bullshit, right? I mean, what are we supposed to interpret here? That saying, oh, I grieve for the innocent Palestinian lives lost, but also I want to continue sending, weapons and financial aid to Israel with absolutely no strings attached, okay, as they continue to use those weapons and use that funding in order to kill Palestinian civilians. You cannot, on the one hand, endorse the strategies, endorse the policies of the government of Israel in massacring civilians in Palestinian-controlled areas, and then turn around and say, I grieve for all of the innocent Palestinian lives lost. I mean, it's fucking nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. And then, of course, the great irony here, right? This is literally his profile. The tweet before this, I will always stand with Ukraine, right? So, of course, you stand with Ukraine when they're being invaded and occupied by the Russian imperialists in that circumstance. But then when it comes to Israel and Gaza, or Israel and the Palestinian people, you're actually on the side of the oppressor. You're on the side of the people doing the invasion. You're on the side of the people doing the apartheid and the ethnic cleansing, of the aggressor state in this situation. I mean, just unbelievable levels of hypocrisy. And by the way, it doesn't even necessarily matter that I see that hypocrisy. You know who sees the hypocrisy in the United States foreign policy, whether it's between Russia and Ukraine versus Israel and Gaza, or Israel and Palestine? You know who sees that? Okay, everybody in the so-called global south, right? That's who sees that. It's not just me pointing that out. It's all of these other countries around the world who have been subjected to U.S. imperialism or British imperialism and colonization, or just broadly Western imperialism and colonization. They all see this shit, and they see right through this bullshit. And they understand exactly how meaningless the rhetoric that is deployed by the United States of America about supporting freedom and democracy and peace and all of this. It's fucking bullshit. And everybody around the world can see it. Okay? Couple more things here. John Fetterman's chief of staff, this guy's been on an absolute tear recently, is retweeting the idea that all the civilian death, the refusal to let in aid, the bombing, and the cutting off of vital resources is all the fault of Hamas, and Israel, of course, has no agency and bears zero responsibility. Now, I've heard some analysis here, as pointed out here by Ryan Grimm, basically alleging that, seems like John Fetterman is scared of AIPAC. He's scared of a lot of these Israeli lobbying firms that could pose a challenge in his next election cycle, and maybe that plays a role in him doing this. I don't know what's worse, honestly, at the end of the day, whether he's selling out his actual values in order to try to remain elected in this position in the Senate, or whether he actually just believes in this shit and that this is genuinely who he is as a person. I don't know what's worse. I mean, you guys tell me. We also had this here, a piece of legislation that was passed through Congress. The Senate just unanimously adopted a resolution condemning pro-Palestinian student protesters as in solidarity with Hamas and anti-Semitic. Of course, conflating the idea that being, anti-Israeli apartheid is the same as being anti-Jewish people somehow, even though a lot of these protests have been led by Jewish students across the United States. The resolution calls to fully and completely support Israel in its war on Gaza, and of course, everybody from Bernie Sanders to Rand Paul voted for this shit. So, again, I don't know what to say about this at this point. This is one of those issues where there is just a broad bipartisan support for Israel, for every single thing that they want to do. And this is, again, amid not only an absolutely brutal bombing campaign, but ahead of, an upcoming invasion into Gaza that is going to be an absolute nightmare. Across the board, it could escalate tensions, not just in the West Bank, where I've seen widespread protests as well, but it could escalate tensions within Gaza. It could escalate tensions broadly in surrounding countries like Jordan and Lebanon and Iran and Egypt as well. Syria and Iraq. So many different places that could end up being embroiled in this this conflict here because of what is inevitably going to come. And meanwhile, we have basically the United States Senate, again, important to point out here, unanimously adopting a resolution condemning some of these pro-Palestinian protests at universities in the United States. But imagine if you put together some sort of a resolution condemning the apartheid nature of the government of Israel, or condemning the massacre of innocent men, women, and children in Gaza, or condemning the illegal expansions of settlements into the West Bank. Imagine what the vote would be if you put forward any of those things. So our Congress can easily, unanimously, condemn student protesters for Palestine, but God forbid they condemn apartheid and ethnic cleansing. It's so fucking pathetic. And, obviously you feel for the people in Gaza. It's an absolute nightmare right now, and as far as I've seen, it doesn't look like it's on track to get any better anytime soon. So I'll keep you guys updated on a couple of different things that I wanted to talk about. We got like the protests that I want to cover, and a couple of other just humanitarian situations that I want to talk about as well. So I'll keep you guys updated over the next couple of days, and again, keep in mind I'm going to be doing some of those interviews with guys like Jordan Ewell and Kyle Kalinske. So stay tuned for that, I guess.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying